Many thanks for that very kind introduction, and I'd really like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. It's not just the first time I've given a presentation at this conference, but it's also the first time I've been to India, so it's quite an experience for me, and for that I'd like to thank the organizers of the meeting for a double benefit for myself. What I want to talk about today is my feelings and my views of where I think poultry nutrition will be in the year 2025, 8 years from now. I was asked to do this based on experience of traveling around the world and looking at the way poultry industries are developing in different parts of the world. And what I thought of when I first started was, well, what's actually happened in the last 50 years which have been of most importance to the industry so far? And I've listed 5 items there: antibiotics, coccidiostats, vitamins, amino acids, and enzymes. And the 2 that are in red are under threat in many parts of the world, perhaps not here in India just yet, but the potential loss of these very useful additives in poultry nutrition mean that we will have significant problems maintaining the performance enhancements that we've seen over the last 50 years. So I'm going to focus on factors which influence your ability to use diets which are free of these products, which actually also encompasses some pretty general nutritional concepts of balancing nutrition, as was described by Dr. Devagada in the introduction. So I believe that the problems are going to be driven by the fact that with antibiotic-free diets, we will have to start considering precision nutrition. We'll have to consider delivering what the bird needs with minimum overlap. So we need to understand what we're feeding to a greater extent than we do at the moment. We need to look for alternatives to antibiotics which are able to contain the bacterial overgrowths that happen when we take these products out of the diet. And we've got to consider when we are working in an environment where we may not have all the raw materials that we'd like. For example, corn and soy are not available, or you have an immediate or a very acute shortage of particular ingredients. You may have to source local ingredients. Understanding their nutritional qualities is also of great importance in order to maintain performance in an antibiotic-free diet. So what happens, the experiences where people have gone to antibiotic-free diets, is you get an increased incidence of enteric disease. We have no direct ability to control microbial populations, and as a result, there is a much larger consequence of nutrient oversupply. And I'll show a couple of slides to try to illustrate this in a moment. Particularly, the area to consider is protein excess more than anything. Protein excess is to be avoided. And then I'll look briefly at, well, what can we do to modulate the bacterial populations as much as possible, thinking of probiotics, prebiotics, and other alternatives. But the comment there on the right-hand side is something that's a problem with these products today. They've got to be effective, and they've got to be robust. It's all very well showing these products work in 1 trial or 2 trials, but antibiotics work over a number of different situations. And we need to be able to show that whatever we think is an alternative is equally robust in working under a range of different situations that birds are exposed to. So 2 things: what did they do? And how do we determine efficacy of the alternatives? I like to use this slide as just general introduction as to what we believe antibiotics were up to. Generally, if nutrition is good and the bird is healthy and it's digesting its feed rapidly, then what we see is starch, protein, and fat entering the small intestine, which is what this schematic is showing, and very quickly being digested and absorbed, so that by the time you get to the terminal ileum on the right-hand side of this slide, there's very little left in terms of fermentable or digestible nutrients, which are now available to the bacterial populations. The bacterial populations increase in numbers as you move from the duodenum through the jejunum to the ileum, and particularly as you get into the ceca. So limitation of raw material supply will actually limit the populations that you will see. Of course, if you feed a poorly digested diet, this sort of scenario happens where a lot of undigested material gets to the small end of the small intestine and perhaps even into the ceca. This provides nutrients for an explosive growth of the microflora, and you see significant potential problems developing. One thing that antibiotics were able to do was, even if you had this situation, it could directly control the problem by wiping out the excess microbial populations. And as a result, if you were feeding a diet that was this poor, you would see a very large benefit of feeding an antibiotic, simply because it's removing the competition that comes from the bacteria that are feeding off the undigested feed. Effectively, what antibiotics were doing was enabling the bird to have a poorly digested diet in front of it and not bear the consequences of a microbial overgrowth. Today, what we have to do is manage the nutrition so this situation does not occur. Just to just give you a highlight of what I mean by the consequences. So this is just any digestibility experiment that is run will show you that if you're using a particular product or a highly digestible ingredient compared to a poorly digestible ingredient, in this case what I'm looking at is a control and an enzyme supplemented wheat-based diet. And if you just focus on the energy and protein digestibility, you can see that the enzyme increased the digestibility of the energy from 67.4 to 73.1%. That represents 8% more energy for the host. But if you think about it from the viewpoint of the microbes who are now going to receive the undigested material, so the 67.4 is digested, but 32.6% is not digested, all of a sudden that amount of undigested material is reduced. And it's reduced to a much greater extent. You can see in this case, the host gets 8% more energy than it was previously receiving, whereas the microbes are getting 17% less. More importantly, look at the protein number. The protein digestibility is increased by 7% according to the host, but it's depressed now by 19% when you look at the nutrient supply for the bacteria at the terminal ileum. Lysine, methionine, serine, threonine, all of these amino acids, you can see very significant reductions in supply to the microbiome. And actually one of the amino acids of great interest to me is glycine, and glycine is one of the most responsive in highly digestible diets, and of course that is actually an essential amino acid required for Clostridium perfringens. So is there any evidence that products which improve digestibility enable us to reduce total populations? Well, there's plenty of information in the literature. This is actually looking at total bacterial numbers from the ileum. So the entire ileum was collected. Bacterial numbers were counted and put into these different classes. In this particular case, if you just look at the total numbers, the total content of the ileum with control diet had about 12 times 10 to, sorry, 1 times 10 to the power, 12 times 10 to the power 10 bacteria colony forming units in the entire ileum. When that control diet was supplemented with avaparcin, which was a particularly effective antibiotic, those numbers were cut by almost 90%. So a direct effect on killing bacteria removed about 90% of the total population. So you can imagine that would improve performance as it was. But a digestibility enhancer, a xylanase used in a wheat-based diet, removed or reduced the nutrient supply significantly and also reduced populations by about 60%. Not as effective, nowhere near as effective as the antibiotic, but showing you that you can actually have a significant effect on total bacterial numbers just through nutrient supply and management. Complicated slide here, but it's actually to try and demonstrate to you that there's issues with protein compared to carbohydrate fermentation in the hind gut. When you allow fermentation to take place with great speed in the absence of any antibiotics or coccidiostats, what you'll find is that bacteria have two choices, and their preferred choice for many species is to ferment carbohydrate if it's available. And the carbohydrate pathway is on the left-hand side of this slide. You can see yields organic acids, lowers the pH, inhibits pathogens, and improves VFA and mineral uptake. So it's producing, carbohydrate fermentation is producing lactate, but mostly acetic, butyrate, and propionic acids, in the HICC, and these are all beneficial to the animal. Whereas if we go to protein fermentation, putrefactive fermentation, what you'll see is, as Dr. Devagowda pointed out, bases being released, amines, ammonia, phenols and indoles, and branched-chain fatty acids coming from branched-chain amino acid fermentations. These are all of questionable value. In fact, they may even be negative and be performance reducing. Now, the interesting thing is, as I said, many bacterial species can choose which pathway they use. So the same bacteria presented with no carbohydrate but with protein will go to the right-hand side of the slide. Similarly, when they're presented with a carbohydrate, they would preferentially go to the left-hand side. And that is why there's a great deal of interest in prebiotic materials, for example, in this particular case. We want to be able to maintain carbohydrate supply to the bacterial populations so that they don't preferentially start to ferment protein. Similarly, showing here, if you take digestive contents and this is actually pig data, but it's showing that indole concentrations and scatol concentrations, which are indices of fermentation of amino acids, are significantly reduced when you provide fermentable carbohydrate. So these putrefactive products are reduced when you provide carbohydrate. And similarly, on the right-hand side, the pH and the branched-chain volatile fatty acid concentrations reduce as you increase the concentration of PDX, which is polydextran, and xylan component, which is, again, two fermentable carbohydrates. So providing these fermentable carbohydrates is driving the fermentation away from protein towards carbohydrate. So the key is to limit poorly digested protein, and how do we do this? We've got to avoid enteric damage, and the first two things I'd point out would be coccidiosis is one of the key problems we run into, and mycotoxins. And control of coccidiosis, I think, is going to be a big problem, a big issue as we go forward. We can choose high quality, highly digestible ingredients that will limit the problems that we run into, but there's a cost implication with this, and I'll come back to this in a minute. It's very important to know the amino acid content of our ingredients, because it's actually amino acids we're overfeeding when we talk about protein. And again, I'll illustrate this in a moment. And we want to, as a result of knowing amino acid content of our ingredients, we should then use synthetic amino acids to best effect, reducing the total protein content of the diet. And also consider digestibility enhancers, phytases, NSPases, proteases, and all other manner of products which have been shown to increase digestibility of the diet. So this slide is just showing 4 different kinds of products, different digestibilities, crude protein contents. These are potential solutions, but the point I would make is even with these very highly digestible ingredients, the problem is that they're so expensive that they would not fit into most diets for broilers or laying hens. So there may be a solution in very young animal diets, but they're not going to be a solution for the vast majority of poultry diets that are out there. This slide shows the digestible lysine content and the total lysine content of various soy type ingredients. The price of these ingredients increases as we go left to right. So the ones on the right, very highly digestible lysine content, very high total lysine content, but very expensive. Again, you have to decide how much you're willing to spend on these ingredients and therefore decide when to use them judiciously. In starter rations is probably where you want to be considering the higher quality ingredients. And as you move into the grower and the finisher rations, move down to cheaper ingredients, but know their amino acid content so that you can optimize their digestion. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. It's basically just a simple formulation of a corn-soy broiler starter diet. On the left-hand side is the ingredient contents of the diet, where I've used methionine and lysine as available synthetics. Then I've introduced threonine into the diet, and then I've introduced arginine, which is becoming available globally. And the formulations run out on the right-hand side. You can see on the crude protein content, the methionine and lysine is a 22.3% protein diet, dropping to 20.77 for threonine when it's used, and again down another 1% to 19.77 when arginine is included. The point I'm trying to make here is, with availability of synthetic amino acids, what happens is the total protein content of the diet drops, which is beneficial to us, provided we can maintain performance. And a lot of work is going on at the moment looking at just how low a protein level can we get to in order to maintain performance. So this is the same data in a different manner. So the blue bars are showing you the total amino acid contents of that diet when only methionine and lysine were allowed as synthetics. Then the red bars are when threonine was allowed as well as methionine and lysine, and arginine is allowed with the green. And you can see that the total amino acid content of the diet drops as you include more and more synthetics, simply because you're dropping soy content of the diet and you're reducing any other protein additives. If we look at it in a different way, if you set all of those amino acid levels at 1 for the diet with arginine in it, and then look at the excess from the other diets, you can see you can deliver exactly the same essential amino acid profile in the diet in 13% less protein, which is a key way to move things forward. Now, this is something that the feed industry is well aware of, but in order to take full advantage of this, we need to actually understand the ingredients we're using as well, because you're using synthetics in a diet where you're actually including soybean meal, where you're including corn, and most cases people are using book values or standard values for the amino acid content of those ingredients and not taking best advantage of some of the variability which exists in the products that you're using. I will come back to the variability in products in a minute with respect to where we think we might be in 2025. So with digestibility enhancers, there's 3 areas that I'm familiar with in terms of the enzyme scenario: NSPases, so xylanases, glucanases, mannases, phytases. How we use phytases has changed dramatically, and I think it will change again in the next 8 years. You'll start to see use of phytase levels which gets incredibly high because of the value this creates in amino acid digestibility. And proteases, which have been shown to improve digestibility of amino acids. All 3 can play a role and increase amino acid digestibility of the ration. We've got to take advantage of these numbers, though. This is a piece of work showing the effect of various levels of a phytase on digestibility of several amino acids. And as you can see, the baseline set at 1 is the digestibility of the amino acids when no phytase was used. The blue bars represent the increment in amino acid digestibility when 500 units of phytase was used, the red when 1500, and the green when 3000 FTUs were used. So what you can see, for example, is when 3000 units of phytase was used, cysteine digestibility was improved by almost 17%, so a very large effect on cysteine, whereas methionine digestibility was only improved by 6%. And that's something that's pretty well established. We know from all the research on this particular product that this is the ranking of the amino acids that you'll see when you start to use phytases. Now, we've got to take advantage of this if we're going to make best use of low protein diets. Because if we were to, for example, take that diet of 3000 units of phytase and put it back into that diet where we've just used arginine in the synthetic amino acid array that I showed you previously, what it shows you is, remember how the green bars showed you all amino acids were being supplied at requirement or at the lowest level in the arginine supplemented ration. If we suddenly put 3000 units of phytase into that diet, we start to oversupply quite a few amino acids, and that's shown in the purple bars. And you can see that in many situations there, we're supplying many of those amino acids at more than 5 or 6% above the requirement of the animal. So it's simply going to waste. So where do I think we should be in 2025? We should be understanding better what we're doing with some of the ingredients and some of the additives that we're using so that we maintain amino acid densities at as close to requirement as possible and not throwing raw materials or amino acids away. So it means whenever you're using an additive, look at the matrix and consider applying it. It can reduce the crude protein of the diet even further than simply using synthetics. In fact, in that particular example, you could have reduced the the crude protein content of the diet by another 6%, and further reduces the risk of putrefaction. Now, very briefly, I'm going to quickly go through some other factors we've got to think about as we go forward. I've been lucky enough in the last 3 years to get a hold of some very large commercial data sets to understand what factors controlled variation in feed conversion ratio in more than 5,000 flocks. The data that we had was management factors, it was nutritional factors, it was many of the inputs into each individual flock. And actually 85% of the variation in FCR of these flocks, which ranged by more than 60 points in FCR from the best to the worst flock for 35-day body weight corrected FCRs. So 60 points in variation, 85% of that was down to the management, in other words, the farm. So there's very little that you can do nutritionally if the management of the flocks are particularly poor. Of course, we just discussed ingredient choice and formulation targets. I'll quickly touch on antimicrobial products which might aid in moving forward, probiotics and prebiotics. Management factors, the things that really counted, biosecurity is a key element today for zoonotic organisms for all reasons. All in, all out is a huge effect on the performance of the flocks. If you have mixed aged flocks in your broiler sheds, for example, it has a major effect in reducing the performance of the entire site. The downtime between flocks was very interesting. There was an optimum of between 8 and 10 days clear out. So the time between the last flock leaving and the first chicks coming in, there's a minimum of 8 to 10 days needed before you'll get optimum FCR. And then obvious things like clean water, feed, bins, lines, and having feed and water available 24 hours a day. Very significant effects of having just breakdowns in feed line management systems so that the birds were out of feed for 12 hours or 16 hours, and water is even more important. And then the obvious things, ventilation, lighting programs, and stocking density has an immense effect. But these are things that most producers are aware of. It's just actually quantifying the value is something that I think as we move forward with big data analysis, we'll be able to get a better handle of and improve our productivity. Antimicrobial products that are out there at the moment, we're suffering at the moment in the European Union. Copper and zinc are both looking at potentially being removed as additives. And therefore it could exacerbate the problems we're going to face if coccidiostats are removed. Essential oils and herb extracts are available and seem to have some significant value under certain circumstances. Lysozyme and other antimicrobial peptides are beginning to show their value in some areas of the world. They are not quite commercially available, but they're very close to it at the moment. There will be interesting products to consider in an antibiotic-free diet. I don't mean you to get too much out of this slide, just to point out that when you have a necrotic enteritis infection model, the bar on the left-hand side was no infection at all, and you can see that there's no height to it at all. In other words, the lesion scores, which are 0 to 8 in this particular graph, there was no lesions when they weren't infected. When they were infected, you can see the lesion score went up dramatically. Then they were infected with, the model, but then 4 different probiotics were offered. And what you can see is something that's common in the literature at the moment. Some probiotics work well some of the time, and others work better in other circumstances. And that really just points to the fact that probiotics are a useful tool. It's just that we don't understand the microbiome well enough at the moment, and it is something we need to improve by 2025 in order to optimize the use of these products. There may be situations where, for example, you would choose probiotic number 4 and get better performance than the use of any of the others. Probiotics, of course, interestingly are all gram-positive at the moment, whereas antibiotics always targeted gram-positive organisms in their own right, which is an irony, but something that is worth considering. The last point here is the thing I think is most important, is we really don't understand the microbiome particularly well. And I want to give you 2 slides which will show you what I mean by that. First off, prebiotics are other products we use as well. These are encouraging the fermentation, the saccharolytic fermentation of bacteria in the lower gut, and balance the production of volatile fatty acids against the amines that I've been talking about. They're non-digestible fermentable sugars. They interact with pathogens, and they interact and stimulate the immune system. Some of them have been shown to do that. Now, what I mean by not understand the microbiome, this color map on the right-hand side, there are 3 trials there which are delineated by the bars with the T1, T2, T3. And this is an analysis of the microbiome split into what's called operational taxonomic units at 5% difference. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this is because this work was done in Australia just this last year. and it was taken from 3 separate flocks, fed the same diet in the same pens over a 5-month period with the same source of chicks. And you can see from the color of the heat maps, each color and each height of bar represents a particular species of bacteria, and shows you very clearly that there's very little consistency from flock to flock to flock. So the conclusion of this experiment and conclusion of my work with microbiome to date is that when you get into too much detail, you actually don't necessarily understand what is a good or what is a bad microbiome. It's not necessarily who they are that's important, it's what they do, so their metabolic capabilities. And in this respect, actually, some cruder methods might actually be more applicable. I refer you to this particular work of Juha Apialahti, where he's using a very crude method called GC profiling, nowhere near as sophisticated as the next generation sequencing you've seen in the previous work. And what he's been able to show is if you take bad flocks, which are those flocks on the bottom panels, so the bottom 2, you can see these traces of GC profile of the microbiome are really quite random and different, whereas the top 2 panels are from 2 separate pieces of work where farms either had good FCR, or in a particular, on the right-hand panel at the top, this was a piece of work out of Northern Ireland where they had very high ME to GE ratio. You can see they've got very similar microbiome profiles. This particular method tends to pick out more what the animal can do than who they are. It's not very specific. It's a little bit more less granular. And maybe that's where we need to be considering is more moving forward, understanding antibiotic-free nutrition is let's have some methods which actually show us something which is meaningful, which may well be understanding what these bacteria can do rather than who they are. Finally, the last section, limitations in raw materials, local ingredients, they're less well characterized, they may have new ANFs, and there could be significant variability. This is just showing individual samples of a particular it was a protein product available in Canada, and you can see significant distribution in protein contents between the different sources of ingredients that are available. So we need to actually have a handle on what the ingredient is that we're talking about. We can use near-infrared to very rapidly look at protein contents, and some of the calibrations are incredibly accurate today. And can be used in real time. So if you do get a very large fluctuation in amino acid content or crude protein content of your raw materials, it may be enough to trigger a reformulation, and it might be of value to you. Remember what I was saying about synthetics. It's only really useful using synthetic amino acids if you actually know the amino acid content, the digestible amino acid content of the major raw materials in your diet. This is actually looking at using near-infrared as well to detect losses in total lysine and reactive lysine, which is an indicator of how much Maillard damage has been done to your ingredients. And again, this is something I think will become more important as time moves on. We need to know not only what the content is, but the digestibility and the usability of these products. Lots of potential anti-nutritional factors, NSP, phytate, lectins, trypsin inhibitors, erucic acid, gossypol, the list is almost endless. The last one, mycotoxins, I want to make a brief comment on because this is important here. It's potentially an increasing problem. It is a problem today, but with erratic climate conditions and moisture at harvest and variable storage conditions, corn is the most susceptible ingredient, and it's actually being produced in areas that previously were devoted to wheat and barley, so we actually find ourselves with a lot more corn and a lot more problems. The issues with it is actually understanding the contamination is quite difficult because often it's in hot spots within a big load of your raw material, so it's difficult to assess. Analysis and identification is not easy and it's not cheap. Methods are improving, but they need to improve to the point that they're real time. And what do you do if you've got a positive shipment? In many cases, many companies end up with an entire boatload of material which they simply can't turn back, they have to do something with. So it's finding better ways of dilution, maybe even segregation of the material to enable its use in less susceptible species. So for the future of mycotoxins, I think faster, better, more thorough analysis is absolutely key. We need better methods of segregation and treatment. There may even be some simple milling that we can apply to remove the most contaminated parts of the grains. Better, more targeted products, so the product should evolve to, and target the mycotoxins of interest, and we should test for their presence in the feed almost on a real-time basis. Again, we'd have to be consistent in the way we use products which are contaminated with mycotoxins and make sure that the most contaminated is kept away from our most valuable categories of animals, for example, broiler breeders. So conclusions. I think new constraints on additives antibiotics will demand action if efficiency is to be maintained as well as it has been today. There is no magic bullet. It'll probably be a combination of solutions, and that will entail quite a bit of work to enable us to understand how best to use these solutions in one big composite offering. Limitations in raw material supply may compound the problems we run into simply because you start to use ingredients you're less familiar with. We may have less well-developed near-infrared calibrations, for example, for lupins, for example, as an ingredient compared to soybean meal, which means that our accuracy and our precision is limited. Knowledge of alternatives and the constraints is needed before they're introduced, so we've got to understand what we're going to do if we're going to use alternative ingredients. I think mycotoxin contamination will be central to feed production and needs to be considered more broadly. It is considered very important in Brazil, less so in other parts of the world, and perhaps we have something to learn from countries such as Brazil in the way they actually handle mycotoxin contamination. And integrated solutions work best. One thing I would leave you with, data collection and analysis from commercial farms I think is going to be essential and does work already. I think farms and commercial companies should be thinking of how they collect their data so that they can improve their own performance by understanding which inputs affect their outputs most effectively. Most of the time, as I said previously, that tends to be down to management or the farm itself, with nutrition playing somewhat of a role, but not the lead role. Thank you very much for your attention.